Good evening. This is Karen Hudis, and this is another episode in the series on the network of global corporate control. As you see, we're not in DC TV's studios. This was because of the Labor Day holiday in the United States. We couldn't get adequate staff. So I didn't want to just rerun another series, which is what we're doing for the people that subscribe to the cable DC TV. But for people that are up on the internet, you can see I'm going to be uploading this episode a little bit later. And the reason why I was very interested in having a live session this today is because there is a lot going on. The main thing that happened is an exchange that I had with Tiburcio Villamor Marcos. He is probably the son of Ferdinand Marcos, although according to Wolfgang Struck, he's an imposter, but be that as it may, the banking cartel has tried very hard to have Tiburcio Villamor Marcos claim that he's entitled to the Global Debt Facility, which for new viewers, this is a trust fund that was set up at the end of World War II and agreed to by all the countries of the world. It contains the world's wealth and the world's monetary gold reserves. And a little bit more about that. The United States monetary gold reserves are not in the Federal Reserve at all. They're with the Global Debt Facility, which is this trust fund. And the reason I'm involved is because I was in the World Bank legal department for over 20 years, and I started noticing that there was a lot of corruption, and I blew the whistle. Which means that I started going to all of the United States authorities, and including the Congress. And I also, I was fired in 2007, and I didn't accept that because I knew that this was retaliation for my blowing the whistle and reporting to the U.S. Congress that there was what we call lack of internal controls. That means that there was no way to know whether the World Bank financial statements were correct, because anybody that tried to report an inaccuracy was going to be fired. And there were other whistleblowers that I was working with, including a woman named Elaine Colville, who was fired for reporting that her unit was getting double charged. And this obviously is no good for the financial records. So I was fired in 2007. I didn't accept that. And as you know, for the people who have been paying attention to this series, which has been going on every week for the last 3 years, I'm extremely persistent, and I'm also very curious, and I wanted to find out whether the corruption was going to end. And I had a pretty good idea that it would end, because just before I was fired, there was a political scientist named Jacek Kugler who came to the World Bank, and I traveled with him to Ghana, and we test drove a model which was developed in the Department of Defense in the National War College. And I found out years after I was fired from the World Bank, I found out that Jacek Kugler had run this model for the world, not just for the World Bank. But when I worked on the model for rule of law at the World Bank, I filled in the numbers. The way the model works is somebody who's very familiar with the problem will estimate who are the stakeholders, that is, who are the people that are active in the problem. And you also estimate how powerful those people or groups are. And then you estimate where they stand on a problem. And so you can see from my website the model that I did for rule of law. And there were, of course, some numbers that were inaccurate because at the time I was very naive and I thought that the press was going to be on my side and was going to help. And what I've subsequently learned is that the press is corrupt. They've been corrupted. And most of the institutions that I thought were going to help turned out are not going to help. Any NGO, that's non-governmental organization, all of the institutions in the world have been corrupted by the bankers. The bankers, when I say the bankers, what do I mean? I mean the people that issue the currency in the world. it's paper currency, they're central banks, and they're actually all one bank. And they own most of the companies that are traded on the capital markets. And there have been studies as to who this network is and what they do. And they've corrupted all of the governments of the world. And they thought that nobody was going to catch them at it. But I've been working together with all the whistleblowers of the world. I started out working with all the whistleblowers at the World Bank. And then when I was fired, I just shifted gears from the World Bank to the world. And now, if you've been following some of the things that I've been posted, we're shifting not only from the world, we're shifting back to the World Bank, which is to say that I've gone to the World Bank and I've asked to have my badge reissued because I was reinstated. I was reinstated in two different ways. I was reinstated in 2009 after I was fired. I went to one of the people in the board, that's Svein Aas. That was when I could still be admitted back into the World Bank. And Svein Aas, a board member, just the day before he was going to be going back to Norway, he reinstated me, and I went back up to one of the other executive directors. I went to the Russians, and I spoke with, I'm trying to remember his name now. And this is the reason, of course, that I script these things, because I'm very bad with names. He was the alternate executive director in Russia. And I went back to him and I said, well, I've been reinstated, but I'm only reinstated as the acting general counsel. If I do anything that you don't agree with, you can always fire me. I said I'd been reinstated twice. That was in 2009. And then in 2016, I went to Peru, which is where they had the annual meetings, or I believe that may have been 2015. In any event, I went to Peru. And I succeeded with my badge because I was a retiree. I had an identification badge. And I went into the meetings and I met with about 20 different delegations and their ministers of finance, including the Indian Minister of Finance. And the board reinstated me, and I agreed at that time when I spoke to the delegations. I said, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of the Board of Governors, which is the group that runs the World Bank and IMF. I said, but if you don't agree with anything I say, you just put it in writing and say that I'm not speaking for you. And of course, since I was speaking for the United States, which has 17% of the vote on the Board of Governors, I had a pretty good grip on the Board of Governors. And what I've been doing is anything that I think is important, I will send to all of the embassies. I'll send emails, and I'll say, this is what I'm proposing to issue on your behalf, speaking for you, and if you don't like it, correct it for me, please. And that's why many of the documents that you see, you'll also see the things that I'm submitting to them for clearance. And we've had a press release that was submitted for clearance about the global debt facility and the global currency reset, because there's a lot of corruption in the world. And the global currency reset, we're going to take the wealth that was set aside at the end of World War II, and we're going to put it into the world's currencies. And we're going to do this peacefully and very slowly, because we obviously don't want to destabilize all of the economies. There's one other thing that we're going to be doing in addition to exchanging gold for the paper currencies, and that is to clean up Fukushima, because that's killing the oceans, and we don't want that, obviously. There is another thing that I'm going to be talking about. I haven't gotten clearance for that yet, and that is, I understand that some of the satellites that are orbiting the Earth have radioactive materials, and they're going to, at some point, fall back to Earth and contaminate the Earth. And so what we need to do is to take those orbiting satellites and to put them, to knock them out of orbit, so that they're not going to fall back to Earth. And those two things, cleaning up Fukushima and getting rid of those radioactive satellites, These are things that are going to require many of the militaries to remain commissioned. But of course, there is a real problem with this because of all the corruption. We've got to, at the same time that we're cleaning up the governments, because all of the governments have been replaced by this, we call it the network of global corporate control. Let me speak a little bit about that group. It was described by 3 mathematicians from the Federal Institute of Technology, and they own most of the companies on the capital markets, and they are directed by a group that has been in charge for a very long time. We call them the bloodline families. Many of them were descended from the pharaohs in Egypt, and they may even stretch back even further. There's a group in Russia that has done a very good analysis of the world's history. That's at Moscow State University. And what they found is that the history that we've been taught in the books is a fabrication. And they've gone back, they've looked at some of the records, and what they've found is that, as I said, the history that we've been taught in the universities is a fabrication. So there is a lot that needs to be corrected, and we're going to have to work together in order to correct it. I've been given a lot of information from what I call what do I call them? They're people who pretend that they're whistleblowers. Controlled opposition, that's what I'm trying to say. They pretend that they're whistleblowers, and they actually give you a lot of good information, but they're really controlled by the group that we've been talking about. And so they're just trying to get you off guard, and then to tell you things that fit what the controllers want, this group in the banking cartel. And what you're hearing and what you're seeing are my house pets. One of the things, actually, I'm not really changing the subject. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is what's going to be happening to the animals on Earth, because human beings are supposedly in charge of them, but there are other animals that are probably smarter than human beings. For example, the whales and the cetaceans. I've been in touch with people who are working with that group. I believe in India they've also forbidden people to put these animals in captivity. But in any event, there is, as I was saying, there's a lot that we don't know that we're going to have to learn about. And the thing that people, yes, that's my dog barking. The cat is, yes. Well, that's what happens when we do this series at home as opposed to in the studio. I think I'm going to have to rearrange the animals and get back to you. Sorry. Well, I'm not going to be able to edit this, so it's going to be like a home movie. I'm going to have to excuse myself for this, but the information that I wanted to discuss with you, I think has some relevancy, and that's why I didn't want to wait anymore before putting this up on YouTube tonight. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is what kind of law we're going to be having. I made a comment on my Facebook and Twitter accounts about the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. The U.S. Supreme Court is actually just play acting, because the United States government is actually, it's not legitimate. And the reason I say that is because the Constitution is not in effect. It has not been in effect since 1871. There were some people on the Supreme Court that understood this, and that was one of them was Anton Scalia, and he was actually going to try to correct the corruption. and he was killed. And there was his body was flown out of Texas before there could be a proper autopsy. And there are other justices. Sandra Day O'Connor has alluded to the fact that the United States Supreme Court is actually not really doing much. They're just play acting and reassuring people. Because how can you have a Supreme Court when it's the Constitution that it's supposedly interpreting is not in effect? This is a charade. And what I've been doing is I've been using the common law, which is in effect, and I've been approaching some of the people who are preventing the world from moving into the global currency reset, which, as I explained, is going to be exchanging the corrupt paper currencies for the gold currencies. And there's also going to be local currencies issued by every village and town. What we're going to do is we're going to have a transition period where the existing paper currencies are going to be phased out gradually. You can't have an abrupt change or the world economy is just going to collapse, which we don't want. We want there to be a smooth transition, and many of the industries that we currently have are going to be phased out because we won't need them anymore. There is a lot of technology which this corrupt group, the banking cartel, has prevented from being used because they want to continue to earn profits. And some of these industries have to do with health. There's been a lot of cures for known diseases, and the pharmacological companies want to continue to sell their drugs. So that's why we're being prevented from accessing existing knowledge. Many healers have been killed for that very reason, in order to perpetuate the profit from the diseases. This sounds heartless, but unfortunately that is the current level of corruption that we're faced with. It's not going to be easy to move to a world which doesn't have this corruption, but we actually have done a lot of transition. That's something that I wanted to tell you about already. We're inheriting a lot of work that's been done before. So, for example, there is a trust that was put aside that contains all of the world's wealth. That happened at the end of World War II. And we've been working together in a large coalition, which now includes all of the military powers of the world. And you may say, well, this is preposterous. But you understand that the people at the very top of the military powers are corrupt. And then there's the other people that are loyal to their people in their countries. And so we've got a very peaceful transition. You saw back in November that a group of Marines landed on the front lawn of the CIA. That's because the CIA is nothing more than this corrupt group. And the Marines, well, they got a group together to let people know that they're not going along with this corrupt group. And that corrupt group tried to have a first strike against Russia, and they also tried to drop a bomb, a nuclear bomb, on Charleston in 2013, and this was derailed. That's because, as I've been telling you, the military powers are really working with all of us in a peaceful transition. And you can see from what I wrote and posted today that Brett Kavanaugh, although there's been a theater of him being confirmed as a justice on the Supreme Court, there are enough people that understand that this is simply theater. And as I said, there is this We call it the Global Debt Facility, which contains the world's wealth. And we're going to be mobilizing the world's wealth for the world's people. That is the actual reality. So you have reality as I'm explaining to you, and as a critical mass of people understand what the truth is. And then you have most of the people who have been duped by this corrupt group. And we have a lot of work to convince the people that the actual reality is as I'm explaining to you. And one of the reasons that it's not going to be so simple to convince everybody is because there's very advanced military technology. It's called, it's mind control. They use, it's like hypnosis to reach into people's thoughts. It sounds like that can't possibly happen, but once you know that people's brains function as modems, and part of the place where they're thinking is in something called the collective unconscious. And this has been documented. You'll discover that although you don't learn about it in the universities, this is the actual case, and this is our reality. And those of us that understand that there is such a thing as scalar weaponry, we know that it's going to be difficult to have this transition, because I say 9 out of 10 people are very susceptible, but it may actually be 8 out of 10. In any event, when you try to talk to people about what the reality actually is, and the person you're talking to is not receptive, just drop the subject. They're sensitive to this technology, and work with the people that you can reach. And it's an actual process to learn how to recognize what the reality is, because you're working with people next to you, your relatives, who are convinced that reality is the lies of the banking cartel. But one of the things that I want to close with is to tell you that we've been working with a very accurate model that came from the United States National War College. It's called the Power Transition Model, and it gives us 90% likelihood of convincing people that the actual reality is as I'm telling you. And in what I posted, I said that ever since I got a commercial lien, that's something using the common law, which is in effect now. Ever since I got a commercial lien on some of the Supreme Court justices, the chances are much higher. And I said I was going to close. I wanted to tell you one other thing, and that is that I have a commercial lien on Sandra Okoro, who was the general counsel of the World Bank. And she may claim that she still is, but she definitely is not. And I finished firing the man who claimed that he was in charge of human resources. And I've been talking to the staff at the World Bank. I wanted to tell you about a conversation I had. I said, I really don't want to have to fire everybody in the Secretariat. I know that there are people that understand that there is reality, and that it's the Board of Governors that's in charge of the place. And the Board of Governors, I'm allowed to speak for them. And I keep saying that I'm going to close, but I definitely will close on this point, and that is that I want to make sure that people understand that I know that I'm speaking for everybody, but I'm not deciding for everybody. And what's going to happen is that as people clean up the corruption, they're going to go back and they're going to look at the things that we did, and they're going to decide how to change them to the way they want them, because we're not a one world order. We're not a dictatorship. We're doing just the opposite. We're leaving it up to individuals to decide how they want the world to be. And I'm looking very much forward to working with everybody. Thank you. Good night.